You spend your whole life building something. Not just a house, not just a name, but a quiet kind of safety, a rhythm, a place where your soul finally feels like it can breathe. And you tell yourself that if you just give enough love, enough patience, enough second chances, one day the people you gave everything to will see you for who you truly are. I used to believe that, until one phone call stripped it all away in less than 5 minutes. My name is Evelyn. I'm 67 years old, and I'm about to tell you how my son sold the house I was living in and the car I was still driving, all without asking me, and told me I had until the next morning to leave everything behind. But if you think this is a story about a sad old woman who gave up, you haven't met me yet. It was a soft, overcast morning when it happened. The kind of day where the sea air clings to everything and the horizon melts into the sky like a watercolor that never quite dries. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a warm mug in my hand, and the sliding door cracked open just enough to let the scent of salt drift in, listening to the slow creak of the wind chimes my husband had hung on the porch 20 years ago. The beach house had once been his grandmother's, passed down to us when Henry was still alive, and after he passed, it became the only place that still felt like home. I was halfway through reading an old letter he'd once written to me when the phone rang. The sound felt too loud in the quiet of the house, and I almost let it go to voicemail, but something inside nudged me to answer. I wish I hadn't. It was Brandon, my only child, my son. His voice was rushed, businesslike, as if we were discussing a delivery or a work order, not my life. He said he'd taken care of everything. The beach house was sold, the car too, and he and Tiffany would be picking me up the next morning to move me into their home so we could be closer. I remember going completely still, like my whole body turned into glass, and I was terrified to move for fear of shattering. I didn't even understand what he meant at first. Sold? What was he talking about? The house was in my name, or at least I thought it was. I had signed something a few years back when I had surgery on my hip, a power of attorney just in case, but I never imagined he would actually use it against me, like this. My voice barely came out when I asked him how he could do that without talking to me first. He just said he'd already made the arrangements, that it was for the best, and that everything's handled, Mom. We'll be there tomorrow morning, early. He didn't ask if I wanted to move. He didn't ask if I had packed. He didn't even ask if I was okay. The call ended before I could say more than a few words, and when I put the phone down, my hands were trembling so badly that I nearly dropped it to the floor. I stared out at the waves for what felt like hours, but time stopped meaning anything. I couldn't cry, not yet. I just sat there stunned, with that awful silence pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. How could he? How could my own son? The child I had carried, nursed, protected. The boy I had raised alone after Henry died. The boy I sacrificed my career and dreams for. How could he see me as something to be handled? I looked around the room, at the photos on the walls, the dried lavender in the glass bottle by the window, the faded blue curtains I'd sewn myself when we first moved in. The thought of leaving it all behind without warning, without a chance to say goodbye to the life I'd poured myself into, it made something break loose inside me, something that had been sleeping for a long, long time. I stood up and tried to steady my breath, but the walls felt like they were closing in. I wandered room to room, touching each object like it was the last time. Henry's old flannel shirt still hanging on the back of the chair, the ceramic bird on the mantel he gave me on our 10th anniversary, the cracked photo frame with Brandon's baby picture from the hospital, all of it. Memories, not just things. And none of it would matter to the strangers who were now buying this house. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat at the kitchen table again, this time in the dark, a single candle flickering beside me as I stared at the folder of legal papers I hadn't looked at in years, trying to remember what exactly I had signed and why. The storm outside had rolled in, quiet and heavy, and the wind rattled the windows like the house itself was grieving. I kept reading the same paragraph over and over, but the words blurred into nothing. I wasn't just losing a house. I was being erased, written out of my own story, pushed out of the only life I had left by the very person I had once held in my arms and promised to protect. And I started to realize this wasn't just careless. This was deliberate, a choice. He didn't just forget to call me, he didn't forget me. He had decided that I no longer mattered. Somewhere around dawn, I walked outside with my cup of cold coffee and stood barefoot on the porch, watching the first pale threads of light stretch across the waves. It used to feel like hope, that light. But now it just looked like a goodbye I hadn't agreed to. The ocean breeze felt sharper than usual, and the wind tugged at the ends of my cardigan like it wanted to carry me off. I felt small, forgotten, unanchored. But beneath all that, something else began to stir. Not anger exactly, but a kind of clarity. The kind that only comes when you realize the worst has already happened and there's nothing left to fear. I went back inside and started to pack, not because I had accepted it, but because I needed to know what was truly mine. I packed Henry's letters, my wedding ring, the carved wooden box where I kept old seashells and baby teeth, and bits of the past that only mattered to me. I packed with calm hands and a storm inside my chest, and as I zipped up the last bag and watched the sun begin to rise over the water, I whispered something out loud. Not to Brandon, not to God, but to myself. You'll regret this. You just don't know it yet. The next morning arrived with a kind of heavy finality, the kind that makes the air feel different, like it's waiting to carry something away. I stood at the front window, my suitcase by the door, wearing the same clothes I'd worn yesterday because nothing else felt right. I'd brushed my hair, put on a little lipstick, even dusted off the pearls Henry gave me on our 25th anniversary. Not for them, not to look presentable, but because I needed to feel like a woman and not some lost thing being shipped off. And as I waited, I told myself that no matter what happened when they pulled into the driveway, I would not cry. When Brandon's car finally appeared, it wasn't just him. The whole family came. Tiffany was in the passenger seat, on her phone as usual, and the kids in the back didn't even look up when they parked. The car door slammed harder than it needed to, and the sound cracked across the quiet yard like a warning. Brandon came up the walkway with that same rushed energy he always had when something was handled, like he was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful. He barely met my eyes when he said, "We're on a tight schedule, Mom. Let's get you loaded up." As if I were a box, as if I didn't need time to say goodbye. Tiffany came in behind him, clicking her heels across the floor, looking around with thinly veiled distaste. She wrinkled her nose at the chipped paint by the windowsill and asked if I'd already called the movers for the furniture, then added that the new owners wanted a clean transition. New owners. She said it like we were talking about handing over a used blender, not a house full of memories and love and grief. I told her I hadn't touched the furniture, that I wasn't taking any of it, and she gave me a tight smile and said that was probably for the best. I saw her glance toward Brandon with that look couples get when they're aligned against someone, and I realized in that moment that this wasn't just his decision. She wanted me out, and she had for a long time. The kids didn't get out of the car. They stayed glued to their screens, not even looking up when Brandon carried my suitcase out. Not one of them came inside to hug me goodbye or to say they'd missed the smell of cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings or the way the sea mist used to hang over the porch when they were little. I don't even know if they remembered those things. Tiffany's voice trailed behind me as I walked through the house one last time, telling Brandon to make sure I didn't grab anything sentimental that wasn't hers. It was like being erased in real time. When we pulled away, I didn't look back. I couldn't. I sat stiffly in the back seat, my hands folded in my lap like a stranger riding with strangers, while Brandon talked on Bluetooth about logistics for their new business, and Tiffany texted nonstop, mumbling about where to put me, so she's not too underfoot. No one asked how I felt. No one asked if I was tired or hungry or needed a break. They talked around me, over me, like I wasn't even there. and I realized that whatever home I thought I still had in their hearts had already been emptied out long before the beach house ever was. Their house was big, new, cold, all granite countertops and white leather sofas, the kind of place that looks like it belongs in a catalog but never feels like anyone's really lived in it. Tiffany led me downstairs, to the basement, and opened a door to a room that smelled faintly of mildew and laundry detergent. There was a fold-out cot against one wall, a shelf with a single lamp, and a plastic bin of sheets. "We've been using it as storage, but it'll be perfect for you," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just make yourself comfortable." Comfortable. There was no window, no pictures, no warmth, just concrete and drywall and a folding chair in the corner, like I was being given a holding cell, not a home. I sat on the edge of the cot while they returned upstairs, their voices floating down like background noise in someone else's life. I felt the silence settle over me like a second skin, pressing into my ribs. I pulled my suitcase closer and unzipped it slowly, taking out Henry's letters and the photo album with our wedding pictures. I placed them on the shelf, the only things in the room that belonged to me. Then I took a deep breath and reminded myself that this wasn't forever. They might think they've cornered me, but I was still standing, still watching, still listening. The next few days passed in a strange kind of haze, like I was moving through syrup. Tiffany had rules. When I could be upstairs, when I could use the kitchen, when to stay out of the way. Brandon was busy most of the time, talking about investors, a new cafe they wanted to open with the money from the house, telling me how this is the future and that I should be proud of how resourceful he'd been. Every word out of his mouth chipped away at something inside me, but I kept nodding, kept quiet, because I needed them to believe I was harmless. One night, I overheard them talking after they thought I'd gone to bed. Tiffany said the arrangement wasn't working, that I was too quiet, always around, and she didn't want the kids picking up on her energy. Brandon said not to worry, that once the business was up and running, they could look into a retirement facility. Something nice, of course. Something where she'd have her own space. I sat there in the dark of the basement, staring at the bare ceiling, feeling something old and fierce bloom inside me. Not rage exactly, not sadness, just a steady, burning sense of betrayal. They thought they were done with me, but what they didn't know, what they would soon find out, was that the woman they had pushed into a corner, the woman they thought was soft and finished, still had fight in her bones and a mind that remembered every detail they thought they'd buried, and I was going to use it. It's a strange thing, realizing you've become a guest in the life of someone you created from nothing, a shadow moving through their space, careful not to leave prints, quiet enough to avoid the sting of their irritation, small enough to be forgotten. I had been living in Brandon and Tiffany's basement for just under 2 weeks, but time had folded in on itself, each day bleeding into the next with the same cautious silence, the same cold rehearsals of politeness, the same underlying sense that I was being tolerated, not welcomed. Every corner of that house was too clean, too curated, and too devoid of any real warmth. And no matter how carefully I crept, I could feel that I was always in the way. The rules, though never written down, became clear fast. No using the washer during Tiffany's reset days, no touching the special coffee beans she ordered online, no watching the family streaming account because it messed with their algorithm, and absolutely no talking to the kids unless they spoke to me first, which, of course, they never did. I had gone from being the woman who rocked Brandon to sleep during night terrors, who scraped together enough to send him to college even when it meant skipping meals, to a nuisance taking up space in the same house he paid a mortgage on with money made by selling the last part of my world. There was one morning, I remember it too clearly, when everything almost came apart. I had been up early, unable to sleep after dreaming of the ocean again, that slow, rhythmic tide pulling at the shore like a heartbeat I could no longer touch. I crept upstairs, barefoot and silent, and decided to make blueberry pancakes, not for anyone else, not to earn points, just because I needed to do one thing that felt like me. I found the old pan in the back of the cupboard and worked carefully, quietly, even set a small bouquet of flowers in the center of the table, clipped from the side of the yard before anyone had noticed. For one moment, I almost felt human again. Tiffany came into the kitchen with her phone in hand and a look that could slice granite. She stopped mid-step, eyes sweeping the table, the stove, the smell of butter and batter hanging warm in the air, and her mouth twisted like she'd bitten into something sour. She didn't say, "Good morning." She didn't ask why I was cooking. She just said flatly that I should have asked before using up their food budget, then added that the kids didn't even like pancakes anymore, and that Brandon had an early call and didn't appreciate being woken up by kitchen noise. I stood there holding the spatula, heat still rising from the pan, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt something inside me crack so sharply it almost made a sound. My hand trembled, just a little. Not enough to drop the pan, but enough that she noticed. For a moment, everything froze. Just the two of us, the sizzle behind me, her anger swelling in the doorway and my pulse hammering against the side of my neck. I thought I was going to scream, or cry, or throw the pan right onto the pristine tile floor and walk out barefoot into the street with nothing but the cardigan on my back. I thought about telling her everything. How I knew about the buyer backing out of their business deal, how I'd found Brandon's new credit card statements showing late payments, how I'd spoken to someone who knew a thing or two about reversing power of attorney misuse. But instead, I turned the stove off slowly, picked up the plate of pancakes, walked to the trash, and scraped every golden circle into the bin, one by one, while she watched. She didn't say a word, and neither did I. After she left the kitchen, I stood there for a long time with my back to the door, both hands braced against the edge of the counter, breathing as steadily as I could, willing my body not to betray the storm boiling beneath my skin. It wasn't time yet. They still thought I was nothing more than a shell. And that illusion was power, if I could just hold on to it long enough. That afternoon, Brandon came down to the basement for the first time in days. He looked tired, frustrated, said something vague about transitions taking longer than expected, and asked if I could lend him a few thousand just to float things for a few weeks. I smiled, the kind of smile women wear when they've been wounded so many times that the muscles have memory, and told him gently that I didn't have that kind of money available. He didn't argue, didn't push, just nodded like he expected it, and left before I could say more. But I saw it then. The first crack in his confidence. He was counting on me to keep bending. He thought I was still soft. That night, while the rest of the house slept, I sat on the edge of the cot and pulled out the yellowed file folder I had hidden between sweaters in my suitcase. Inside were copies of old letters, bank forms, and most importantly, the original property paperwork that Henry and I had drawn up before his passing. Brandon may have held a temporary power of attorney, but there were clauses he hadn't read, and names on that paper he had long since forgotten. I smiled, not because it was funny, but because I realized that what they took from me wasn't gone. It had just gone quiet, like a seed under snow, waiting. And while I waited, I made calls, quiet ones, to names from a lifetime ago, people who remembered who I used to be before I gave it all away, and one of them, an old friend of Henry's, said 6 words that made something in me light up again. "I've been waiting to hear from you." They thought they'd buried me in that basement, but I was only beginning to rise. You learn, after a certain age, how to disappear without anyone noticing, how to nod at the right times, how to make your voice small enough to be mistaken for the air, how to move through someone else's house like a ghost no one has to clean up after. But what they never realize is that silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it's the sound of someone sharpening their blade in the dark. After that morning with the pancakes, after that moment I nearly broke, something inside me locked into place. Not with fury, not with heat, but with the kind of icy focus that only comes when you've got nothing left to lose and finally start to realize what that kind of freedom actually costs. and I was ready to pay. The name I'd almost forgotten was Wallace Granger, Henry's oldest friend, a man with an old soul and sharp instincts who had once helped us put together the documents for the beach house when we were both too young and too naive to imagine a world where we'd need to guard our own child from it. Wallace had gone gray and slowed down, but his mind was still precise, his voice steady and warm, and when I reached him after all these years, he said something that settled my nerves like warm cloth. "You finally calling me means you've had enough." He remembered the paperwork, remembered how we'd structured the ownership, and how Henry had insisted on a clause that would protect me should anything ever feel off. Brandon had the power of attorney, but not full title, and certainly not the right to sell without written consent from me or proof of medical incompetence, which, despite Tiffany's whispers, had never been established or even suggested in a legal sense. Wallace told me he'd look into everything, quietly, and that I should keep calm, gather documents, and not tip my hand until we had enough to move. So I did exactly that. I moved through the house like fog, light and slow, saying little, touching nothing. I listened. I kept notes. I waited until they left for school and work, then carefully sorted through boxes in the garage where they'd shoved my belongings, like I was already halfway packed for the retirement home they were planning for me. I found the envelope with Henry's original will, with our wedding bands tucked inside, still in the little velvet box we'd kept behind our old dresser mirror. I found photos they hadn't bothered to display. Not of me, of course, but of Brandon as a child, with his lopsided grin and scraped knees, back when he still looked at me like I was his whole world. That boy was gone, and I was no longer going to mourn him. Wallace called again a few days later. The buyer of the house had backed out after learning of the contested sale. The papers were under review. Brandon didn't know it yet, but the money he'd used for the business was already being pulled into question, and once the full audit began, his loans would start to collapse like a row of matchsticks. We weren't ready to act yet, but the fuse had been lit. All I had to do was keep playing my role. One evening, just after dinner, as I was rinsing my plate in the sink, Tiffany came in wearing one of her bright, synthetic smiles and asked if I'd be interested in looking at brochures for independent senior communities. She said it like she was offering me a gift, a vacation, a soft place to land. She said the kids were getting older and needed more room, and that it might be nice for me to have friends my age. I turned to her slowly, wiped my hands on the towel, and said, "I'd love to take a look." Her eyes widened just a fraction, surprised by my cooperation. But she smiled, relieved, and went to fetch the glossy packets from the counter like a woman who'd finally won a long battle. I flipped through the pages while she watched, nodding thoughtfully, pretending to consider whether I'd prefer sunset views or community shuttle access. But inside, I was counting every lie she'd told, every dismissive glance, every moment they treated me like an obligation. I smiled back, warm and polite, and asked if I could keep the brochures. She said, of course, clearly pleased with herself. That night, I tucked them into the back of the drawer under my pillow, and every time I opened it afterward, I reminded myself what they really were. Not plans, but proof, evidence of intent. The next day brought a moment I wasn't prepared for. Not anger, not cruelty, but something worse. Pity. I overheard Brandon on the phone with his friend, telling him how hard it was having a parent who doesn't know when it's time to let go, how I'd be happier once I wasn't in the way. He said it with that voice people use when they think they're being compassionate, the kind of voice that wraps the knife in velvet before driving it in. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there behind the partially closed door, holding a basket of laundry like someone in a play who'd forgotten their lines. It hit me harder than the insults, because pity meant they'd already decided I was gone, that I didn't have anything left to offer. That evening, I almost broke again. I was alone in the basement, folding blankets that still smelled faintly of ocean air and dryer sheets from my old life, when I felt the tears come on hard and fast, the kind that come without warning. the kind you can't stop once they start. My chest heaved, not from sadness, but from the sheer injustice of being made invisible in your own bloodline. I sat down hard on the cot, my hands trembling, and for a few terrifying seconds, I thought my body might just give out. My heart raced too fast, my breath caught, and I thought, what if they win by default? What if this is how I disappear? But just then, the phone buzzed on the shelf beside me. One sharp, quiet vibration. I picked it up. A text from Wallace. Just 3 words. It's almost time. And somehow, like magic, the panic faded. The rhythm in my chest slowed, my eyes cleared, and I realized something important. They had taken my house, my car, my place at the table, but they hadn't taken me. Not yet, and not ever. There's a quiet kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing something the people around you don't. Not in a cruel way, not to punish, but in that calm, steady way a storm knows it's coming long before the wind changes. I had spent weeks moving like wallpaper, blending into the background of their carefully staged lives, listening to whispers not meant for me, folding my dignity into tighter and tighter corners, all the while gathering every thread I would need to unravel the whole thing. And the day finally came when the first stitch popped loose. It started with a phone call. Brandon's voice echoed down the hallway in a tone I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. Tight, defensive, shaken. I could only hear fragments, but it was enough. What do you mean the funds are frozen? That money was already moved. No, she doesn't have access anymore. Then silence. Then a curse, soft but sharp, followed by the thump of something hitting the table hard. When he emerged from his office a few minutes later, his face was pale, jaw tight, hands twitching as he picked up his keys and told Tiffany they needed to go fix something now. She followed without a word, heels clicking, lips pressed into a line. They left the kids at home without a second thought. That told me everything I needed to know. Something had slipped, and it was bigger than they were ready for. I waited exactly 45 minutes after they left. Then I went upstairs, opened the front hall closet, and pulled out the fireproof lockbox I had hidden there 2 nights earlier. Inside were copies of everything Wallace had given me, the documents that showed I was still a partial owner of the house, the letter from the county records office confirming the title had never properly transferred, and the notarized notice Wallace had filed to block the sale until the matter could be legally resolved. I set them out on the dining table, right next to the glossy brochures for the retirement communities they had oh so generously offered me. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to cry. I just wanted them to see it, laid bare, unignorable, undeniable. But the bigger moment, the one they didn't see coming, was already in motion. Earlier that week, I'd met with a realtor in secret, the same woman who'd once handled a sale for Marla, an old friend of mine from the gallery. I had explained everything, who I was, what I had left, and what I was looking for. She hadn't blinked, just smiled and said she had the perfect place, a little fixer-upper by the bay, small but sunlit, with enough room for a garden and no stairs to bother my hip. I'd visited it that morning while Brandon and Tiffany were out. I'd walked through each room slowly, touching the worn wood of the windowsills, the soft creak of the floor beneath my feet, and I knew it wasn't the house Henry and I had built, but it was mine. Mine to claim, mine to fill with new things, new memories, or none at all. And for the first time in a long while, I could see a future not defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I chose to rebuild. So when Brandon and Tiffany returned that afternoon, faces flushed with panic and questions they weren't ready to answer, they found me waiting for them in the living room, not angry, not shouting, but composed. I had packed my bag already, just one, and beside it sat the manila folder Wallace had sent with a ribbon tied around it like a gift. I watched Brandon's expression shift from confusion to dread the moment his eyes landed on it, and I spoke before he could open his mouth. I told them I was leaving. Not tomorrow, not later, but now. That the sale had been contested, and likely would be reversed, and that the funds they'd use to float their shiny little dream cafe would soon be the subject of a formal investigation. That I had no interest in dragging it through the courts, no desire to ruin them, but I also wouldn't be staying a single day longer in a house where I was spoken about like an object and treated like an outdated appliance no one could figure out how to throw away. Tiffany's mouth opened and closed twice before she found her voice. She said something about miscommunication and misunderstood intentions, that they were only trying to help, but the words rang hollow in the space between us. Brandon stared at the folder like it might catch fire. I didn't wait for more. I picked up my bag, slipped my arms into my coat, and told them they could keep the basement, and the guilt that came with it. I walked out the front door with the weight of a decade falling off my shoulders. The air outside was brisk, sharp in that early spring way that makes your skin tingle and your breath feel earned. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had already taken the most important thing with me, the knowledge that I had not been erased. Marla met me at the curb with her old blue station wagon, just like we'd planned. She didn't ask questions, just opened the door, reached over to push aside her grandkid's car seat, and said, "Ready?" I nodded once, climbed in, and felt something loosen in my chest as we pulled away. Not grief, not rage, but something cleaner, like freedom with a bit of salt in the air. Later that night, I stood in the empty living room of my new place, the keys still warm in my hand, the walls bare but full of possibility. I opened the windows, even though it was cold, just to feel the air move through the space. I let it touch everything, the floor, the curtains, my skin, like a blessing. I was alone, yes, but not defeated, not discarded, not forgotten. And for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. There's a strange kind of peace that settles in once you've left the place where your dignity was left to rot, a peace that doesn't come with silence or safety, but with a soft hum inside your chest that says, "You made it out. You're not done yet, but you made it out." My new home wasn't perfect. The kitchen was dated, the paint flaking near the baseboards, and the front steps creaked like they were holding back tears. But it was mine, fully and legally mine, with keys in my pocket and my name alone on the deed. I spent the first week drinking instant coffee on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the fog roll in from the water, and for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to come in and tell me I was in the way. Wallace had filed the final paperwork, and within days the sale of the beach house was officially reversed. The buyers backed out permanently. The funds Brandon had received were flagged, and his business venture, the one he launched with such smug certainty, collapsed before it ever opened. I didn't gloat. I didn't call. I just let the truth settle where it belonged. But the quiet didn't last long. One morning, just as I was pruning a stubborn hydrangea bush that refused to bloom, a letter arrived. Hand-delivered, no return address, just my name in Brandon's handwriting, the ink slightly smeared like he'd written it too fast. Inside was a single-page note. No apology, no remorse, just a cold statement. "They're suing me. You know they are. They're coming for everything. I hope you're satisfied." And for a moment, just a moment, I felt the faintest pang of guilt, not because I regretted any of it, but because I once loved that boy so much I would have given up everything just to see him smile. And now all he could offer me was bitterness wrapped in blame. But the real twist came 3 weeks later when Wallace called and said I needed to come by his office. When I arrived, he handed me a folder and simply said, "You should read this in private." I opened it that evening, sitting on the floor of my little living room with a cup of tea and the soft tick of the wall clock echoing in the quiet. Inside was a sealed letter in Henry's handwriting, a letter I had never seen before. It turned out, months before Henry passed, he had made a private amendment to his estate plans, one that Wallace had held separately in case of emergency misuse. The letter was addressed to me. In it, Henry explained that he had seen signs in Brandon even back then. A growing coldness, a hunger for control, a sense of entitlement he hadn't wanted to believe in but couldn't ignore. He'd added a clause to the trust that stated if Brandon ever acted to remove me from the home without consent or used legal authority for personal gain, his entire inheritance would be revoked and redirected. Not to me, but to our granddaughter, the youngest, the only one who had once crawled into my lap and asked for bedtime stories before her parents told her to stop bothering Grandma. I wept then, not for Henry, not for what had been lost, but for the strange grace of being loved so carefully by someone who wasn't even alive to see how right he had been. The legal wheels turned fast. Wallace handled everything. Within weeks, Brandon's accounts were frozen, his assets seized, and the trust was transferred to a new fund in the granddaughter's name, set to mature when she turned 18, with one condition, that she would have regular contact with me if she chose to receive it. I didn't want revenge. I wanted legacy, and somehow I had been given both. Tiffany tried to reach out. Once. She left a voicemail, her voice soft and sugary, asking if we could talk things through and move forward as a family. I didn't call back. Some bridges aren't worth crossing twice. Brandon never called, but I received a short thank you card from their daughter, hand-drawn in crooked letters, with a sketch of a seashell and the words, "Grandma, I hope you're happy at your new house. Maybe someday we can visit." And that was the only closure I ever needed. Now I spend my mornings in the garden and my evenings in the little chair by the window, where the sun hits just right around 5 o'clock and everything turns gold for a few minutes, as if the universe pauses to let you remember who you are. I volunteer at the local library twice a week. I bake when I feel like it, and I answer my phone only when I want to. There is no one left to tell me where I belong, because I already know. And if you've stayed with me this far, maybe you've seen a piece of yourself in my story. Maybe you've given too much, stayed too long, been made to feel like your worth had an expiration date. But let me tell you something from one woman to another. We don't expire. We evolve. We rise. We remember. Let me ask you this. Have you ever been treated like you were just a burden, only to find out that you were the backbone of it all along? What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. I'm listening.